The fifth consecutive month of record-breaking rainfall had turned Clearwater Meadows into an insurance adjuster's worst nightmare rather than the productive family farm it once was. The historic lowlands that Jacob Mercer's great-great-grandfather had purchased in 1868, just after returning from the Civil War, now stood mostly underwater, its agricultural potential drowned beneath an expanding pond that decades of conventional drainage systems had failed to control. What began as a desperate measure to save his livelihood would unearth a secret that had rested silently beneath murky waters for over 150 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the final days of the Confederacy. Jacob stood at the edge of the swollen pond, his mud-caked boots sinking deeper with each passing minute as the torrential downpour continued. At 42, his once youthful face had weathered into a permanent mask of worry, deep creases etched around eyes that had witnessed too many failed harvests. His broad shoulders, built through decades of physical labor, now slouched under the weight of imminent bankruptcy notices and his family's uncertain future. "Not looking good, Rusty," he muttered to the aging Chesapeake Bay retriever faithfully stationed beside him. The dog whined softly, pressing against his master's leg as they surveyed the disaster before them. What had once been a modest 3-acre pond, a charming feature of the property that had watered livestock for generations, had swollen to consume nearly 20 acres of prime farmland. After months of unprecedented rainfall, the Mercer family had survived the Great Depression, weathered the agricultural crisis of the 1980s, and adapted through shifting market demands for generations. But 3 consecutive years of increasingly extreme weather patterns had pushed Clearwater Meadows to the brink of financial collapse. The latest storm system, a slow-moving atmospheric river parked over Charleston County, South Carolina, threatened to deliver the final blow. Jacob climbed into his mud-splattered pickup truck, where the emergency water pump he'd rented sat in the bed, an expense he could scarcely afford. The weatherman had predicted a 12-hour break in the rainfall, a narrow window of opportunity to try saving what remained of his soybean crop by draining the ever-expanding pond before the next system moved in. 20 acres reclaimed, he murmured as he started the engine. That's what we need to stay afloat. The bank's final notice had arrived yesterday, giving him 30 days to make a substantial payment or face foreclosure. The letter had concluded with a handwritten note mentioning that Coastal Development Partners had expressed significant interest in acquiring the property, a thinly veiled suggestion that Jacob should consider selling his family's heritage to make way for another luxury housing development. The expanding pond had concerned 3 generations of Mercers. His grandfather insisted there was something unnatural about how the Depression had formed, too perfectly circular for nature's random handiwork, he'd maintained. Jacob's father had simply accepted it as an inconvenient but manageable feature of the property. But now, with crop yields falling and margins razor-thin, Jacob had no choice but to attempt what his ancestors had avoided, draining the pond completely to reclaim crucial acreage. The sound of tires on wet gravel announced an unwelcome visitor. A gleaming black Range Rover bearing the Coastal Development Partners logo navigated the muddy farm entrance with surprising ease. Catherine Blackwell, CDP's chief acquisition specialist for the past decade, stepped out wearing impractical designer rain boots that had clearly never seen actual fieldwork. She knew every struggling farmer in 3 counties by name and could recite their property values and debt loads from memory. Her grandfather had been a sharecropper who had lost everything in the boll weevil epidemic, giving her what she claimed was a special appreciation for the challenges facing modern family farms. Today, her normally pleasant expression was replaced with professional detachment as she approached. Jacob, She greeted him with a perfunctory nod. "I wish this was just a social call." "Another offer?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She handed him a sealed envelope. 12% above our last proposal. That's all the increase I could get approved. The board's eager to begin development before interest rates climb higher. Took the envelope without opening it. "Thanks for trying, Catherine." She glanced toward the swollen pond. "Have you considered Professor Mitchell's interest in your property?" Jacob's jaw tightened. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, chair of Civil War Studies at the University of South Carolina and Coastal Development's historical consultant, had been making increasingly persistent requests to survey the pond and surrounding acreage. Her latest email had suggested anomalous features consistent with mid-19th century military activity, a claim Jacob found suspiciously aligned with developers' interests. "I'm not giving Mitchell access to my property," he said flatly. "Not while I still have options." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "Jacob, I understand the farm's been in your family for generations, but at some point, you have to face reality. That land hasn't been consistently productive in years, and Mitchell's preliminary surveys suggest—" "I'll make it productive," he interrupted. "Today. That's why I rented the industrial pump," she sighed. "Just don't wait too long to consider alternatives. Our offer won't stay on the table indefinitely." After Catherine left, Jacob stood motionless beside his truck, the corporate offer crumpled in his fist. Rusty pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort as the brief respite from rain allowed weak sunlight to break through the clouds. The emergency pump was a desperate gamble. At $200 per week, the rental alone would drain what remained of his operating capital. But if he could reclaim even 15 acres from the expanding pond, he might salvage enough of the season to keep the bank at bay for another quarter. What Jacob couldn't possibly know as he unloaded the heavy equipment was that the pond's unusual, circular shape, the feature his grandfather had found so suspicious, was no accident of nature. Beneath the murky waters lay an answer to one of the Civil War's most enduring mysteries, a secret that had remained submerged since the final desperate days of April 1865, when the Confederacy's last hope slipped beneath the waters of a rural South Carolina farm pond, carrying a cargo that would rewrite history books and transform Clearwater Meadows from a failing family farm into ground zero for a historical revelation that would captivate the world. As Jacob connected the last sections of drainage pipe and primed the pump, the first rumble of distant thunder warned that his window of opportunity was already beginning to close. What had started as a desperate measure to save his family's legacy was about to uncover something far more significant than farmland, something that had waited patiently in the darkness for over a century and a half to tell its story. Jacob Mercer was a fifth-generation farmer with the calloused hands and sun-weathered face to prove it. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a frame hardened by decades of physical labor, he'd once been the high school football star with scholarship, offers that could have taken him far from Clearwater Meadows. Instead, he'd chosen to follow the path laid out by generations of Mercers before him, returning after college with an agriculture degree and innovative ideas for modernizing the family operation. Those dreams now seemed as distant as the clear skies South Carolina hadn't seen in months. His once hopeful enthusiasm had eroded under the relentless pressure of mounting debt, unpredictable weather patterns, and the steady encroachment of developers purchasing neighboring farms at an alarming rate. The wedding band that still circled his left ring finger served as a daily reminder of what else he'd lost in the process. Claire had supported his farming ambitions for 12 years, before finally accepting that their marriage had become collateral, damage to his obsession with saving Clearwater Meadows. "Can't really blame her for leaving," he often told Rusty during their evening walks around the property. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The loyal retriever had been their compromise when Claire realized children wouldn't be possible with the farm's precarious finances. Now the dog was Jacob's sole companion, faithfully following him through the daily struggles of keeping the operation afloat. As Jacob activated the industrial pump, its powerful engine roaring to life, he felt the familiar twinge of pain in his lower back, a souvenir from a tractor accident 3 years earlier that had landed him in the hospital for a week and added another layer of medical debt to his financial burdens. The doctors had recommended desk work, a suggestion that had prompted his only genuine laugh during that painful hospital stay. Mercer men don't abandon their fields, his father had told him countless times throughout childhood, a mantra passed down through generations. Harold Mercer had worked these same fields until his final heart attack at 64, collapsing beside his tractor just 2 years ago. The medical examiner had attributed the heart failure to decades of stress, poor rural healthcare access, and the stubborn refusal to follow doctors' orders regarding rest and medication. A family tradition Jacob seemed determined to continue. The pump began drawing water from the bloated pond, sending it through a series of pipes toward a drainage canal that would eventually feed into the Edisto River tributary that marked the eastern boundary of the property. Jacob had calculated that the pump could move approximately 500 gallons per minute. Impressive, but still only a fraction of what would be needed to make a significant impact before the next storm system arrived. Rusty barked suddenly, drawing Jacob's attention to movement at the far edge of the pond. A great blue heron, one of several that had taken up residence as the pond expanded, took flight, its massive wings beating slowly as it sought more peaceful hunting grounds away from the mechanical intrusion. "Sorry about that," Jacob murmured, feeling a pang of guilt. The expanding pond had devastated his farming operation, but created a flourishing wetland ecosystem that attracted dozens of bird species. Claire, with her environmental science background, would have documented each one, marveling at the silver lining to their agricultural disaster. As the water level began its glacially slow descent, Jacob trudged back to the weathered farmhouse that dominated the modest rise overlooking the southern property line. The 2-story colonial revival had once been the pride of Charleston County when Jacob's great-great-grandfather, Lieutenant Ezekiel Mercer, had constructed it in 1868. Local legend held that the house had been built using timber salvaged from abandoned Confederate fortifications, though family records were frustratingly vague about specific details of Ezekiel's post-war activities. Inside, the house told the story of Clearwater Meadows' gradual decline. Rooms that had once showcased period furniture now stood empty, their contents sold to cover operating expenses or tax bills. Jacob had consolidated his living space to the kitchen, his father's old study, and a single upstairs bedroom, leaving the remainder of the house closed off to save on heating and cooling costs. In the study, Jacob reviewed the farm's finances. For what seemed the 1,000th time, searching for some overlooked path to solvency, the numbers remained stubbornly unchanged. Without a miracle, Clearwater Meadows would change hands within the month, ending 5 generations of Mercer stewardship. His gaze drifted to the portrait of Lieutenant Ezekiel Mercer that hung above the fireplace. The stern-faced Confederate officer stared back, his expression revealing nothing of the circumstances that had allowed him to purchase such a substantial property immediately after a devastating war when most returning Southern soldiers faced destitution. "What would you do, old man?" Jacob asked the painting, a habit he'd developed since his father's passing. The silent portrait offered no guidance, its secrets, like those of many Civil War veterans, taken to the grave. Jacob's attention was drawn to the antique roll-top desk in the corner, the one family heirloom he had refused to sell despite numerous offers from antique dealers. It had belonged to Ezekiel himself, passed down through generations with strict instructions that it remain within the family. Jacob's father had used it daily, though he'd complained about its impractical size and limited storage. On impulse, Jacob crossed the room and sat in the worn leather chair, running his hands over the ornately carved wooden surface. Unlike his father, he rarely used the desk, finding its numerous small drawers and compartments inefficient for modern paperwork. Today, however, something drew him to the old piece of furniture, a nagging sensation he couldn't quite identify. The center drawer stuck slightly as it always had, requiring a firm tug to open. Inside lay the expected assortment of 19th-century fountain pens, a tarnished letter opener, and various papers his father had deemed important enough to save. But as Jacob began to close the drawer, his eye caught a small irregularity. In the wood grain along the back panel, a seam he'd never noticed before. Curious, he pressed against different points along the panel until a soft click rewarded his efforts. A hidden compartment sprang open, revealing a leather-bound journal and a tarnished brass key, unlike any modern design he'd ever seen. The journal's cover bore no title, only the initials EM, stamped in faded gold leaf. As Jacob carefully opened the brittle pages, a folded map slipped out. Hand-drawn in faded ink on yellowed paper, it showed Clearwater Meadows as it had existed in 1865, with one feature prominently marked, the pond. Except in Ezekiel's time, it hadn't been labelled as a pond at all, but rather as the repository. A distant rumble of thunder reminded Jacob that his window of opportunity for draining the pond was rapidly closing. He tucked the map and journal into his jacket pocket alongside the mysterious key, his fatigue momentarily forgotten as he headed back outside. Whatever secrets his great-great-grandfather had kept, they would have to wait until he'd secured the farm's immediate future. Little did Jacob know that the two missions were about to converge in a discovery that would change everything. The history of Clearwater Meadows was inextricably linked to the turbulent final days of the American Civil War. While South Carolina's role as the first state to secede and the birthplace of the rebellion was well documented in history books, the specific activities in Charleston County during April 1865 remained shrouded in mystery and contradictory accounts. Lieutenant Ezekiel Mercer had served with distinction in the Confederate Navy, though his service records contained conspicuous gaps during the war's final months. Family law maintained that he had been attached to a special naval unit tasked with alternative transport methods. A vague description that had generated countless speculative dinner conversations among generations of Mercers, but little concrete understanding. What was known with certainty was that Ezekiel had returned from the war with sufficient resources to purchase the 180-acre property when most Confederate veterans faced financial ruin. The original deed, framed in the farmhouse hallway, registered the purchase date as June 12, 1868, just 3 years after Appomattox. More curious still, Ezekiel had specifically selected this seemingly unremarkable parcel over more fertile options available at lower prices, insisting on these precise acres despite their distance from major waterways. Unusual priorities for a man with naval experience. Jacob's grandfather, Walter Mercer, had been particularly obsessed with the property's mysterious pond. During Jacob's childhood, the old man would often take him fishing there, using these quiet outings to share family stories and speculations about its unusual characteristics. "Nature don't make circles this perfect," Walter would insist, gesturing toward the pond's nearly symmetrical shoreline. "Your great-grandpa told me Ezekiel insisted no one ever drain it or disturb the bottom. Made it a condition in his will, though those restrictions expired with your father's generation." The pond had been significantly smaller then, roughly 3 acres compared to its current 20, and considerably shallower. Walter claimed that Ezekiel had engineered specific overflow channels that maintained the pond at a constant depth regardless of rainfall, a sophisticated system that had deteriorated over subsequent decades as the original drainage infrastructure failed. Beyond family legends, Clearwater Meadows held objective historical significance. The property sat 12 miles inland from Charleston Harbor along what had once been a critical supply route. Military historians had documented substantial Confederate activity throughout this corridor during the war's final weeks, as desperate Southern forces attempted to move remaining resources away from advancing Union troops. What made this particular area even more intriguing to historians was its connection to one of the Civil War's most enduring mysteries, the disappearance of the last significant Confederate treasury shipment. In early April 1865, as Richmond fell and Confederate leadership fled south, approximately $450,000 in gold and silver, worth tens of millions in today's currency, along with an unspecified collection of documents, had been dispatched from Richmond toward a naval rendezvous point near Charleston. The shipment vanished somewhere en route, spawning generations of treasure hunters and conspiracy theories. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell's academic reputation had been built on her controversial theory that this lost Confederate treasury had never reached the coast, but had instead been diverted inland for safekeeping. Her recent publication suggested that innovative Confederate naval technologies, specifically experimental submersible vessels, might have played a role in this operation. The connection between Mitchell's research and her consulting work for Coastal Development Partners had always struck Jacob as suspiciously convenient. The development company had purchased 4 neighboring historic properties in the past 3 years, each time following a similar pattern. Initial surveying under the guise of historical preservation, followed by disappointing findings that conveniently cleared the way for residential development. As Jacob monitored the industrial pump's progress, the rain holding off for now, he pulled Ezekiel's journal from his pocket. The handwriting was precise but faded, the cursive style formal and difficult to decipher in the fading afternoon light. He flipped carefully through the brittle pages, searching for any mention of the pond. April 17th, 1865. Orders received from Commander Buchanan. The HL Mosquito to be deployed for inland waterway transport of critical assets. Mechanism modifications. Completed under my supervision. Draft reduced to accommodate shallow depth operations. God willing, we shall preserve what remains of our cause's resources from the approaching vandals. Jacob paused, rereading the entry. The HL Mosquito was unfamiliar to him, though the naming convention echoed the famous Confederate submarine. H.L. Hunley, the first combat submarine to sink an enemy warship. Unlike the well-documented Hunley, he'd never encountered any mention of a mosquito in the countless Civil War books that filled the farmhouse shelves. He continued reading, flipping forward several pages. April 23rd, 1865. The repository prepared. As instructed. Water depth sufficient but barely so. Channel from creek successfully diverted. Local laborers employed for excavation dismissed with explanation of new livestock watering pond. Captain Harris confident in submersible's ability to navigate inland waterway to designated location. Awaiting arrival within 48 hours. The repository. The same notation that appeared on the map. Jacob's pulse quickened as he glanced toward the pond, now noticeably lower as the powerful pump continued its work. Was it possible that his great-great-grandfather had created the pond deliberately to conceal something beneath its waters? April 26th, 1865. Mosquito arrived under cover of darkness. Cargo transfer completed without incident despite challenging conditions. Captain Harris reports Union patrols increasing throughout region. Decision made to submerge vessel at repository until safe extraction possible. Coordinates and depth recorded for recovery operations. May God preserve our sacrifice until restoration becomes possible. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as the implications of what he was reading began to crystallize. The pond hadn't been a natural feature at all, but a deliberate construction, a hiding place for something the Confederates had deemed worth preserving from Union capture. The final entry related to the pond appeared months later, dated November 8, 1865, recovery operation postponed indefinitely. Word received that special agents actively seek remaining naval assets. Decision made to maintain repository undisturbed. Property to be secured through personal ownership to ensure continued security. Captain Harris and remaining crew have taken oath of silence. The location of our deposit shall remain known only to those directly involved, until such time as safe recovery becomes viable. I shall establish residence here to maintain vigilance over what lies beneath. What followed was a crude, hand-drawn schematic of what appeared to be a small submarine, significantly different from the Hunley design familiar to Civil War enthusiasts. This vessel was sleeker, with notations indicating special modifications for extended inland navigation and reduced draft requirements. Jacob looked up from the journal toward the steadily draining pond, his mind racing with implications. If Ezekiel's journal was accurate, something of immense historical significance, possibly even the lost Confederate treasury, might lie preserved beneath the murky waters that had threatened his family's livelihood. The timing couldn't be more critical. The pond was relinquishing its water after over 150 years of secrecy, potentially revealing its contents just as Jacob was about to lose the property to foreclosure. And Dr. Mitchell, through Coastal Development Partners, was already maneuvering to gain access. A flash of lightning on the horizon warned that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Whatever lay beneath the waters of the repository, Jacob was determined to discover it first. The industrial pump labored through the afternoon, drawing down the pond's water level inch by precious inch. Jacob paced along the receding shoreline, Rusty trotting faithfully beside him, both watching as features of the pond bottom gradually emerged from their watery concealment. The first revelations were mundane: submerged logs, the rusty frame of an old bicycle, various discarded farm implements from decades past, archaeological layers of the Mercer family history, but nothing to suggest a Civil War submarine. As twilight approached, a bank of ominous clouds rolled in from the west. The weather radar on Jacob's phone showed the approaching storm system, its leading edge already dropping heavy precipitation less than 30 miles away. His window was closing rapidly. The pump had managed to lower the water level by nearly 4 feet. Impressive progress, but still insufficient to reveal anything in the pond's deeper central section. "We need more time," he muttered to Rusty, who responded with a sympathetic whine. The dog suddenly perked up, ears forward, attention fixed on something in the pond's center. Following the animal's gaze, Jacob spotted an unusual disturbance in the water. A perfect circle of ripples emanating from a point where no debris was visible. Checking the time, barely an hour before the storm's projected arrival, Jacob made a split-second decision. He jogged back to the farmhouse, returning minutes later with a wetsuit he hadn't used since the scuba diving phase of his brief marriage. It was tight in the shoulders after years of disuse, but it would provide some insulation against the pond's cool water. "Stay," he commanded Rusty, who reluctantly obeyed, watching anxiously from the shore as Jacob waded into the murky water. The pond bottom was a treacherous mix of silt and debris, each step releasing clouds of sediment that further reduced visibility. He moved cautiously toward the center where the water still reached chest height despite hours of pumping. The approaching storm transformed the quality of light, casting an eerie greenish glow over the landscape as Jacob reached the area where he'd observed the ripples. His feet encountered something solid and distinctly unnatural, a curved surface with the unmistakable feel of metal rather than stone. Heart racing, he took a deep breath and ducked beneath the surface. Underwater visibility was near zero, forcing Jacob to rely on touch alone. His hands traced what felt like a curved metal hull, corroded but still structurally intact. As his fingers explored further, they encountered an unmistakable feature, a circular protrusion with a distinctive mechanism, a hatch. Jacob surfaced, gasping for air, mind racing. The journal's descriptions, dismissed by generations as exaggerated, family lore suddenly manifested as tangible reality beneath his fingertips. The HL Mosquito, a previously undocumented Confederate submarine, lay preserved in the artificial pond his ancestor had created specifically to conceal it. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Jacob waded back to shore, the earlier excitement of discovery now tempered by urgent practicality. The approaching storm would soon refill the pond faster than his pump could remove water, potentially resubmerging his discovery for weeks or months, time he didn't have before the bank's deadline. "We need to see it now, Rusty," he said, hurrying to his truck. From the equipment shed, he retrieved the farm's emergency generator and the most powerful floodlights he owned. If he couldn't prevent the pond from refilling, he could at least document what lay beneath while it remained partially visible. The rain intensified as Jacob set up the equipment, positioning the generator on higher ground and aiming the floodlights toward the pond's center. Rusty huddled miserably under the truck's rear bumper, unwilling to abandon his master despite the deteriorating conditions. With the lights powered up, their powerful beams cut through the rainfall and murky water, revealing what the afternoon's pumping had partially uncovered. The distinctive curved outline of a submersible vessel emerged from the gloom, approximately 30 feet in length, its design similar to but distinctly different from the famous Hunley. Lightning flashed overhead, briefly illuminating the entire scene in stark relief. In that momentary flash, Jacob glimpsed something that stopped his breath. A portion of the submarine's conning tower had become visible, and etched into its metal surface was a clearly recognizable Confederate naval emblem. The historical significance of what lay before him was impossible to overstate. While the Hunley was celebrated as a revolutionary achievement in naval warfare, this vessel, the Mosquito mentioned in Ezekiel's journal, represented an entirely undocumented advancement in Confederate naval technology. Its inland location, far from any navigable waterway, suggested capabilities historians had never attributed to Civil War-era submarines. Jacob frantically photographed everything visible, knowing the storm would soon erase this opportunity. Each flash of his camera captured another angle of the partially revealed vessel, each image confirming that this was no product of family myth-making, but a legitimate historical artifact of immense significance. As he worked, the water level in the pond began to rise perceptibly, the combined effect of his disabled pump and the intensifying rainfall. The submarine, briefly revealed after more than a century and a half of concealment, was beginning to disappear once more beneath the rising waters. In a final desperate effort, Jacob waded back into the pond, the floodlights illuminating his path as he fought against the increasingly turbulent water. Reaching the submarine's exposed hatch, he brushed away accumulated silt, revealing an elaborate locking mechanism, a design far more sophisticated than anything documented in Civil War naval engineering. With trembling hands, Jacob retrieved the mysterious brass key from his pocket. The corroded lock mechanism seemed an impossible fit for the tarnished key, separated by over 150 years of history. Yet something compelled him to try. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as though the mechanism had been designed to resist the corrosive effects of long-term submersion. Jacob hesitated, suddenly aware of the enormity of what he was attempting. If Ezekiel's journal was accurate, this submarine potentially contained the last significant Confederate Treasury shipment, artifacts worth millions of dollars and of incalculable historical value. A violent thunderclap directly overhead made the decision for him. The storm was intensifying rapidly, and whatever lay inside would soon be inaccessible again. Jacob turned the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed to reverberate through the water itself, the hatch mechanism began to turn. Decades of corrosion and sediment initially resisted, but the precision engineering gradually prevailed. The circular hatch, designed to maintain watertight integrity in far more demanding circumstances than a farm pond, began to rotate. As the hatch finally swung upward, releasing a burst of trapped air that bubbled dramatically to the surface, Jacob's floodlights illuminated the interior of a vessel that had remained sealed and untouched since the desperate final days of the Confederacy. What he saw inside would force historians to rewrite textbooks and transform a failing family farm into the epicenter of the most significant Civil War discovery in generations. The storm raged through the night, pounding Clearwater Meadows with nearly 3 inches of rain in 5 hours. By dawn, the pond had not only refilled, but expanded, further swallowing additional acreage and completely submerging the submarine once more. Only Jacob's photographs and the waterlogged journal provided evidence of what lay beneath the innocuous-looking farm pond. Jacob had spent the remainder of the night in a state of agitated insomnia, his mind replaying what he'd glimpsed inside. The submarine, before safety concerns and the rising water, had forced him to retreat. The vessel's interior had been remarkably preserved, a time capsule of Civil War naval technology containing equipment far more advanced than contemporary historical accounts suggested possible. But it was the submarine's cargo that had momentarily paralyzed him with astonishment. Stacked wooden crates bearing Confederate Treasury markings, still intact after more than a century and a half underwater. He had managed to extract only a single item before securing the hatch, a waterproof oilskin packet containing documents that now lay spread across his kitchen table, their contents challenging everything he thought he knew about the Confederacy's final days. The sound of vehicles approaching drew Jacob to the window. The rain had subsided temporarily, leaving behind a landscape transformed by standing water and mud. A now familiar black Range Rover led a procession that included 2 university-marked SUVs and a large truck bearing equipment shrouded under tarps. "They're not wasting any time," Jacob muttered to Rusty, who growled softly in response. He'd anticipated Catherine Blackwell's return, but not this quickly, and certainly not with an entourage of what appeared to be academic personnel. Jacob stepped onto the porch as the vehicles parked in the farmyard. Catherine emerged first, her typically perfect appearance somewhat diminished by practical outerwear, conceding to the muddy conditions. Behind her came a tall, angular woman in her 50s, whose bearing suggested authority despite her rumpled academic attire. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell. Jacob recognized her from university publications and her occasional appearances on historical documentaries. "Jacob," Catherine called with forced cheerfulness that failed to reach her eyes. "I hope you don't mind the early visit. Given the extraordinary weather conditions, we wanted to check on your property." "My property is still my property," Jacob replied evenly, making no move to invite them closer. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Eleanor Mitchell from the university's Civil War Studies Department. I've been hoping to meet you for some time." Jacob reluctantly shook her hand, noting the surprisingly strong grip. "Professor, seems you've brought quite the entourage for a social call." Mitchell's gaze swept past him toward the expanded pond visible beyond the house. "Hardly social, Mr. Mercer. We're here with a proposal that could benefit us both." Substantially. May we come in? Jacob hesitated, acutely aware of the historical documents spread across his kitchen table. Let's talk out here, he suggested, gesturing toward the covered porch. House is a mess. The third vehicle's doors opened, revealing two men who began unloading sophisticated-looking equipment. One removed a drone from a protective case, while the other assembled what appeared to be ground-penetrating radar components. Your technicians seem eager to get started, Jacob observed coldly. Interesting definition of a proposal that includes bringing survey equipment onto private property. Without permission. Mitchell's expression tightened momentarily before she forced a placating smile. Merely preparatory, Mr. Mercer. We anticipated you'd see the value in our offer. Catherine produced a leather portfolio, extracting a document that she placed on the porch railing between them. Coastal Development Partners is prepared to offer you 30% above market value for Clearwater Meadows, with an additional rider guaranteeing historical preservation of any significant findings on the property. Jacob glanced at the figure, circled at the bottom of the page, enough to clear his debts and provide a modest, fresh start elsewhere. 6 months ago, he might have been tempted. Today, knowing what lay beneath his pond, the offer was almost laughable. Not interested, he said flatly. Mitchell's professional composure slipped slightly. Mr. Mercer, perhaps you don't fully understand what we're offering. This is considerably above what this waterlogged property is worth in today's market. I understand perfectly, Jacob replied. What I don't understand is why a distinguished historian and a development company are so interested in a failing farm. Unless, of course, you already know something about my property that you think I don't. The subtle shift in Mitchell's expression confirmed his suspicion. She recovered quickly, adopting an air of academic condescension. Historical satellite imaging and topographical analysis suggest unusual features on your property consistent with Civil War-era activity. As the foremost expert in Confederate naval operations during the war's final months, I have reason to believe your land may contain artifacts of minor historical interest. Minor? Jacob echoed, unable to suppress a skeptical laugh. Is that why you've been trying to access my property for 2 years, for minor historical interest? Mitchell's eyes narrowed. Mr. Mercer, let me be direct. The historical preservation rider in our offer protects your family's legacy far better than your current financial situation allows. When the bank forecloses next month, there will be no such protections. Whatever history lies beneath your pond will be bulldozed for tract housing by whoever purchases this land at auction. The calculation in her assessment was coldly accurate. Jacob's 30-day notice would expire soon, and without immediate financial intervention, Clearwater Meadows would indeed face public auction. The historical significance of his discovery meant nothing to bankruptcy proceedings. I appreciate your concern for my family's legacy, Jacob said, not bothering to disguise his sarcasm. But I'm exploring other options. Catherine stepped forward, her tone softening into practiced sympathy. Jacob, we've known each other since high school. I'm trying to help you salvage something from this situation. Whatever Dr. Mitchell finds here, historically significant or not, our offer guarantees you financial security. And what exactly does the good professor expect to find? Jacob pressed, watching Mitchell's reaction carefully. You've never fully explained your specific interest in my pond. Mitchell exchanged a quick glance with Catherine before responding. Confederate activity in this region during April 1865 is well documented. Several transportation routes for retreating Confederate assets passed near this property. It's possible, though admittedly speculative, that small artifacts related to these movements might be recovered. She was lying by omission, Jacob realized. Mitchell knew, or at least strongly suspected, exactly what lay beneath the pond. What remained unclear was how she had obtained this knowledge when Ezekiel's journal had remained hidden in the secret compartment until yesterday. "I see," Jacob said, maintaining a neutral expression. "Well, as fascinating as Confederate buttons and uniform fragments might be, I'm not selling." Mitchell's composed facade cracked further. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not sure you understand the legal complexities involved here. If historically significant artifacts are discovered on private property, state regulations regarding proper archaeological assessment come into play. As chair of the state's Historical Conservation Committee, I could initiate mandatory assessment proceedings." The threat was thinly veiled, but Jacob had anticipated this approach from his reading overnight. The documents he'd retrieved from the submarine included communications suggesting that certain Confederate naval operations had operated under presidential authority with specific protections that might supersede modern state jurisdiction. "Feel free to file whatever paperwork you think appropriate, Professor," Jacob replied calmly. "In the meantime, I'll ask you and your equipment to leave my property. You're trespassing." Mitchell stared at him with undisguised frustration before turning abruptly toward her vehicle. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Mercer, one that could cost you everything." As the unwelcome visitors departed, Jacob watched the drone they had deployed hover briefly over the pond before following the vehicles down the driveway. The confrontation had confirmed his suspicions. Mitchell and Coastal Development were working in tandem, the academic credentials providing cover for what was essentially a treasure-hunting operation. What troubled him most was the timing. How had they known to arrive just hours after his discovery? The storm would have obscured any satellite observation, and he'd told no one about what he'd found. Jacob glanced toward the kitchen, where the Confederate documents lay spread across the table. Whatever historical secrets the submarine contained, he needed help from someone he could trust, someone with the expertise to understand their significance, but without connections to Dr. Mitchell's academic network. His options were limited, and time was running out. The documents Jacob had retrieved from the submarine comprised an assortment of waterproof oilskin packets containing official Confederate naval orders, technical schematics, and personal correspondence. Despite spending the entire night studying them, he'd barely scratched the surface of their historical implications. What was clear, however, was that the HL Mosquito represented a technological advancement far beyond what Civil War historians had previously documented. Unlike the Hunley, which required a crew of 8 to manually crank its propulsion system, the Mosquito utilized a more sophisticated compressed air mechanism, allowing it to travel greater distances with a smaller crew. More remarkably, the vessel had been specifically designed for what the documents termed inland waterway navigation, capable of traversing shallow rivers and streams inaccessible to conventional naval vessels. The submarine's mission, outlined in orders signed by Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory himself, was both explicit and extraordinary. Transport the final treasury reserves of the collapsing Confederacy to predetermined secure locations where they would remain preserved from Union confiscation until such time as the cause might again rise. Jacob carefully photographed each document before securing them in his gun safe, the only water-resistant fireproof storage available on the farm. The immediate challenge was twofold: protecting his discovery from Mitchell's academic machinery and finding a legitimate expert who could help authenticate and preserve what he'd found. After careful consideration, Jacob made a call to Dr. Marcus, Washington, curator of military history at the Charleston Museum. Unlike Mitchell, whose career had been built on theoretical reconstructions of Confederate naval technology, Washington was known for his meticulous authentication work and political neutrality regarding Civil War artifacts. More importantly, he had no known connections to coastal development or any other commercial interests. "Dr. Washington's office," answered a cheerful receptionist. "This is Jacob Mercer," he began, suddenly aware of how improbable his story would sound. "I need to speak with Dr. Washington about a potentially significant Civil War discovery on my property." There was a pause. "May I tell him what type of artifact you found, Mr. Mercer?" Jacob took a deep breath. "A previously undocumented Confederate submarine with what appears to be a Treasury shipment still on board." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably before the receptionist responded with practiced politeness. "I see. Dr. Washington receives many such inquiries. He's currently conducting research off-site, but I can schedule you for next—" "Tell him it's related to the HL Mosquito," Jacob interrupted, "and that I have documentary evidence of its commissioning by Secretary Mallory in April 1865. This time the silence was briefer. "One moment, please." Minutes later, Jacob found himself speaking directly with Washington, the curator's initial skepticism quickly evolving into cautious interest as Jacob described specific details from the documents. "These markings you're describing," Washington said, his academic reserve mingling with poorly concealed excitement, "they match unpublished inventory records in our collection. Mr. Mercer, if what you found is authentic, and that remains a substantial if, it would represent the most significant Civil War naval discovery since the raising of the Hundley." "I need someone who isn't connected to Dr. Eleanor Mitchell or coastal development," Jacob explained. "They were here this morning with survey equipment and thinly veiled threats about state historical preservation regulations." Washington's tone sharpened. "Mitchell's involvement is concerning. Her methodologies have been questioned within academic circles, particularly her relationships with commercial entities. When could I examine these documents and the site?" They arranged for Washington to visit that afternoon, the curator agreeing to bring specialized photographic equipment and authentication tools. Jacob emphasized the need for discretion, explaining his precarious financial situation and the impending foreclosure. After ending the call, Jacob returned to the pond. The morning's brief respite from rain had ended, and a steady drizzle once again increased the water level. The submarine, briefly exposed the previous night, now lay completely submerged beneath muddy water. Without industrial-grade pumping equipment, far beyond what he could afford to rent again, the vessel would remain inaccessible. A movement at the far edge of the property caught Jacob's attention. Through the curtain of rain, he glimpsed what appeared to be someone crouching in the tree line before disappearing into the woods. Rusty growled, confirming that Jacob hadn't imagined the intruder. "Mitchell doesn't give up easily," he muttered, reaching instinctively for the revolver he kept for snake encounters. The property's isolation, once a source of peace, now felt vulnerable. Whatever surveillance Mitchell had deployed, Jacob couldn't patrol the entire perimeter of Clearwater Meadows by himself. He needed to accelerate his plans. The documents alone provided compelling evidence, but without access to the submarine itself, authenticating his discovery would be challenging. More critically, the 30-day foreclosure clock continued ticking, with less than 3 weeks remaining. Before the bank took possession, as Jacob walked back toward the house, formulating strategies for protecting his discovery, he failed to notice the small device attached beneath his truck's rear bumper, a GPS tracker transmitting his location in real time to someone very interested in his movements. The race to control the most significant lost Confederate artifact in generations had already begun, and Jacob was dangerously behind. Dr. Marcus Washington arrived at Clearwater Meadows precisely at the arranged time, his modest sedan navigating the muddy farm roads with obvious difficulty. The curator was younger than Jacob had expected, early 40s at most, and African-American, a detail that momentarily surprised Jacob, given Washington's specialization in Confederate military history. Family tradition, Washington explained, with a wry smile when he caught Jacob's expression. My great-great-grandfather was a freedman who documented Union naval operations during the blockade of Charleston. His journals inspired my career choice, though I'll admit my focus on Confederate. Naval technology raises eyebrows at family reunions. The curator's self-deprecating humor immediately put Jacob at ease. Washington had brought a specialized case containing authentication equipment, along with a waterproof camera system he described as museum grade. I'd like to see the documents first, Washington said once they were inside. Physical evidence provides context before we tackle the more challenging underwater assessment. Jacob retrieved the oilskin packets from his safe, carefully arranging them on clean towels spread across the kitchen table. Washington donned cotton gloves before touching anything, his methodical approach confirming his professional credentials. My God, the curator whispered after examining the first document, a commissioning order for the H.L. Mosquito signed by Secretary Mallory. The letterhead, the paper composition, the signature pattern, these are consistent with authenticated Confederate Naval Department communications from March-April 1865. Washington photographed each document using specialized lighting to reveal watermarks and other authentication features. His initial skepticism transformed into barely contained excitement as he progressed through the collection. Mr. Mercer, these appear to be genuine, he finally declared, removing his gloves. Of course, comprehensive authentication would require laboratory analysis, but these display all the hallmarks of legitimate Confederate naval documentation from the war's final phase. Jacob felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Independent confirmation, even preliminary, validated his discovery as something beyond family mythology. What about these? Jacob asked, pointing to technical schematics detailing the Mosquito's unique propulsion system. Washington studied them with increasing amazement. This technology, it's years ahead of anything we thought the Confederacy possessed. The Hunley used a manual cranking system with severe operational limitations. This compressed air mechanism would have extended range and endurance dramatically. He looked up at Jacob. If the actual vessel displays these design elements, it would fundamentally change our understanding of Civil War naval engineering. Their discussion was interrupted by Rusty's sudden barking. Jacob moved to the window in time to see a drone. Hovering approximately 50 yards from the house, its camera clearly oriented toward them. Mitchell, Jacob muttered. She's been monitoring the property since this morning. Washington joined him at the window, his expression darkening. Eleanor Mitchell has a controversial reputation in academic circles. Her theories about Confederate technology have been dismissed as speculative at best, but she secured significant private funding despite peer criticism. From development companies like Coastal, Jacob asked. Washington nodded. Among others, there's been concern about her methods, particularly her tendency to conduct preliminary excavations without proper documentation or permissions. The drone maintained its position for several moments before abruptly ascending and disappearing over the tree line. Its message had been delivered. They were being watched. We should examine the pond, Jacob suggested, aware that time might be limited before more direct interference. Outside, the persistent drizzle had temporarily subsided, though the heavy cloud cover threatened additional rainfall. Jacob led Washington to the pond's edge, explaining his previous night's discovery and the submarine's current submerged state. Washington surveyed the expanded pond with a professional eye. Without specialized excavation equipment, accessing the vessel again will be challenging. Even museum-grade underwater cameras would have limited effectiveness in this turbidity. I can't afford to rent the industrial pump again, Jacob admitted, and even if I could, Mitchell would notice immediately. Washington considered the situation. There might be another approach. Rather than trying to access the entire submarine, We could focus on obtaining indisputable evidence of its existence using less obvious methods. From his case, he produced what looked like a modified fishing rod with a small device attached to its end. Ground-penetrating sonar. Museum conservators use it for preliminary assessment of submerged artifacts. It won't provide detailed imaging, but it should confirm the vessel's dimensions and position. For the next hour, they methodically surveyed the pond, Washington recording the sonar data on a specialized tablet. Despite the crude technology, the readings clearly indicated a substantial metal object with dimensions matching the expected size of the submarine. This confirms something is definitely there, Washington said, reviewing the compiled data. The size and composition are consistent with a Civil War-era submarine. Combined with your documentation, it's compelling evidence. As they packed up the equipment, Jacob noticed a vehicle slowly passing on the county road bordering his property. The third such pass in the last 30 minutes. "We're being monitored," he observed quietly. Washington nodded, his expression grave. "Mr. Mercer, what you've discovered has implications beyond historical significance. The Confederate Treasury shipment alone would be worth millions in today's market, both for its gold content and for its historical value. Add the technological significance of an advanced submarine, and you're looking at one of the most valuable Civil War discoveries ever made, which makes it a target," Jacob concluded. "Precisely, and you're facing this situation with limited resources and a ticking foreclosure clock." Washington carefully secured his equipment in the sedan's trunk. "You need more substantial resources and protection than I can provide alone. What do you suggest?" "I have contacts at the state's Underwater Archaeology Division, people I trust implicitly. With your permission, I'd like to bring in a small team to help document and protect this discovery." Jacob hesitated, weighing the risks of expanding the circle of knowledge against the practical impossibility of securing the site alone. "How quickly can they get here?" "Tomorrow morning at the earliest," Washington replied. "In the meantime, I wouldn't leave the property unattended. Based on Mitchell's reputation, she won't limit herself to drone surveillance for long." As if to emphasize Washington's warning, Jacob's phone chimed with an automatic alert from the property's boundary motion sensors, the same system he'd installed years ago to detect trespassing hunters. Someone was crossing onto Clearwater Meadows from the eastern perimeter, moving toward the pond. The motion sensor alert complicated Jacob's already precarious situation. With Washington's equipment still unpacked and daylight fading, confronting potential trespassers presented significant risks. "Does anyone else have legitimate business on your property?" Washington asked, noting Jacob's concerned expression. "No one," Jacob confirmed, pulling up the security camera feed on his phone. The image quality was poor, another casualty of deferred maintenance, but clearly showed two figures in dark clothing moving purposefully through the eastern woodlot toward the pond. "Those aren't local kids looking for fishing spots." Washington quickly packed his remaining equipment. "We should document this intrusion. If Mitchell is employing people to trespass, it strengthens our position legally." Jacob retrieved his shotgun from the truck, loaded with rock salt rather than lethal ammunition, a farmer's compromise for deterrence without deadly force. Together, they circled through the southern field, using the remaining daylight and terrain to approach the trespassers without being detected. The intruders had reached the pond's edge when Jacob and Washington positioned themselves behind the equipment shed approximately 50 yards away. From this vantage point, Jacob could see they carried sophisticated equipment, including what appeared to be a small submersible drone with lights and manipulator arms. "They're planning to examine the submarine," Washington whispered. "That's a commercial-grade ROV, remote-operated vehicle, expensive equipment for a casual trespass." Jacob raised his phone, recording video of the unauthorized intrusion as the men prepared to deploy their underwater drone. Their movements suggested professional training, methodical and coordinated without unnecessary communication. "Those aren't academics," Jacob observed. "Mitchell must have hired private contractors." Washington nodded grimly. "It's happened before. When conventional academic channels prove too slow or restrictive, Mitchell has allegedly employed private archaeological contractors with fewer ethical constraints." The men were fully focused on deploying their equipment, presenting Jacob with a decision: confront them immediately or allow them to proceed and gather more evidence of their trespassing. Before he could decide, Rusty settled the matter by bolting from behind the shed, barking aggressively as he charged toward the intruders. "So much for the element of surprise," Jacob muttered, standing and raising his voice. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The men reacted with practiced efficiency, immediately abandoning their equipment and retreating toward the eastern boundary. Their rapid withdrawal suggested a predetermined escape plan, confirming these were professionals rather than opportunistic treasure hunters. "They left their equipment," Washington noted as they approached the abandoned ROV setup. "That's tens of thousands of dollars just left behind." "Which means they'll be back," Jacob replied, examining the sophisticated underwater drone without touching it. "And they'll know we're onto them." Washington photographed the abandoned equipment from multiple angles, documenting serial numbers and any identifying features. This provides tangible evidence of attempted unauthorized exploration. "We should contact the sheriff's department." Jacob's laugh held no humor. "Sheriff Davies and Dr. Mitchell serve on the same historical preservation committee. Reporting this would only accelerate her timeline." Washington considered this complication. "Then we use it differently, as leverage. We don't need law enforcement if we have sufficient documentation to establish a pattern of illegal activity." They gathered the abandoned equipment and returned to the farmhouse, where Washington connected his laptop to a satellite internet hotspot, independent of the farm's unreliable connection. For the next hour, he compiled the day's findings into a comprehensive digital dossier: the documentary evidence, sonar readings, and video of the trespassers attempting to deploy underwater exploration equipment. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Washington said, finalizing the secure upload to his museum's protected server. "Mitchell's actions suggest she knows exactly what's down there and is growing desperate to access it before proper archaeological protocols can be established. What I don't understand is how she knew in the first place," Jacob said, spreading Ezekiel's journal and the property map on the table. "These documents were hidden in a secret compartment until yesterday. Yet Mitchell has clearly been pursuing this for years." Washington studied the map thoughtfully. There may have been other records. Confederate naval operations, especially covert missions during the war's final phase, often employed redundant documentation as insurance against loss or capture. "The timing bothers me too," Jacob added. "Why push so aggressively now after the property has been in my family for generations?" "The foreclosure," Washington suggested. "Property records are public. If Mitchell has been monitoring potentially significant historical sites, your financial vulnerability would present an ideal opportunity." A sudden insight struck Jacob. Or maybe something else changed. He pulled out his phone, searching through local news archives until finding what he suspected. Here, 3 months ago, construction crews discovered previously unknown Confederate documents during renovation of the old Charleston Naval Repository building. The articles don't detail the specific contents, but Mitchell is listed as the consulting historian who took possession of the findings, Washington finished, reading over Jacob's shoulder. That could have been her confirmation of what was already suspected. Their theorizing was interrupted by another security alert, this time from the motion sensor covering the farm's main entrance. The camera feed showed 3 vehicles approaching. The familiar black Range Rover flanked by two unmarked white vans. "They're escalating," Washington observed grimly. "Those look like private security contractors, not academics." Jacob checked his watch. Nearly 10 p.m., far too late for legitimate business. "Looks like Mitchell's done with subtle approaches." The approaching headlights illuminated the rain-slicked driveway, creating an ominous procession toward the farmhouse. Whatever Mitchell had planned, the confrontation was now inevitable. "Call your contacts at the Underwater Archaeology Division," Jacob said, checking that his shotgun was loaded. "Tell them we need that team here tonight, not tomorrow." The vehicles halted in a semicircle facing the farmhouse, headlights creating a wall of blinding illumination, a deliberate intimidation tactic. Jacob and Washington positioned themselves on the porch, staying carefully in shadow while maintaining clear sightlines to the vehicles. "Record everything," Jacob instructed, activating his phone's camera as Washington did the same with more sophisticated equipment. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell emerged from the Range Rover, flanked by two men whose bearing and vigilant posture marked them as security professionals rather than academics. Catherine Blackwell remained conspicuously absent, a concerning deviation from her usual role as corporate intermediary. "Mr. Mercer," Mitchell called, her tone falsely cordial. "I apologize for the late visit, but developments have made immediate discussion necessary. Trespassing and attempted unauthorized exploration of my property made discussion necessary," Jacob countered loudly, ensuring his voice carried clearly for the recording. "Your contractors abandoned rather expensive equipment when confronted." Mitchell's composure flickered momentarily before she regained control. "A misunderstanding. I contracted a standard underwater survey team to assess potential environmental impact of the expanded pond on county watershed systems. If they inadvertently crossed property boundaries, save it for the Historical Society Board." Washington interrupted, stepping forward into partial light. "We have comprehensive documentation of attempted unauthorized archaeological exploration using commercial ROV equipment." Mitchell's expression hardened upon recognizing Washington. "Marcus, I'm surprised to find you involved in this situation. The Charleston Museum doesn't typically engage in private archaeological assessment without proper protocols." "I'm here as an independent consultant at Mr. Mercer's request," Washington replied evenly, "and I've documented sufficient evidence to justify immediate implementation of archaeological site protection measures under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act." The reference to specific legal protection visibly unsettled Mitchell, though she recovered quickly. "Whatever you think you found, Marcus, context matters. I've been researching patterns of Confederate naval activity in this region for decades. My work deserves academic priority. Your work deserves peer review and adherence to professional standards," Washington countered, "neither of which includes hiring private contractors to conduct unauthorized exploration of privately owned historical sites." While they exchanged academic barbs, Jacob noticed the men from the white vans had begun spreading out, taking positions that effectively surrounded the farmhouse. Their coordinated movement suggested military or law enforcement background, far more threatening than academic researchers. Jacob raised his shotgun slightly, not pointing it directly at anyone, but ensuring it was visible. "Your security team is trespassing on private property. I suggest they return to their vehicles immediately." Mitchell glanced at the armed men before addressing Jacob directly, dropping any pretense of collegiality. "Mr. Mercer, let's dispense with the theatrics. We both know what lies beneath your pond, a Confederate submarine containing the last significant shipment of Treasury assets evacuated from Richmond before the Union occupation." The blunt acknowledgement confirmed Jacob's suspicions about her prior knowledge. "If you know that, then you also know its historical significance requires proper archaeological protocols, not private recovery operations. Proper protocols take Years, Mitchell replied dismissively. Years of bureaucratic delays, academic infighting, and resource limitations. Meanwhile, irreplaceable historical artifacts deteriorate underwater, or remain perfectly preserved as they have for over 150 years, Washington interjected. Your urgency suggests priorities beyond historical preservation. Mitchell's attention remained fixed on Jacob. I'm prepared to offer you a compromise that circumvents your impending foreclosure while ensuring historical authentication of the discovery. I'm listening, Jacob said cautiously, aware that Washington was still recording. Coastal development purchases the property at 40% above market value, sufficient to clear your debts with substantial remaining capital. I lead a private archaeological recovery operation with full academic documentation, but without the delays of institutional oversight. You receive appropriate historical credit for the discovery and 5% of any recovered artifact's appraised value. The offer was calculatedly tempting, financial salvation packaged with historical recognition and potential additional compensation. For a moment, Jacob understood how Mitchell had successfully navigated academic and commercial interests for decades and defied decline. Jacob asked, already anticipating the answer. Mitchell's smile held no warmth. The bank forecloses in less than 3 weeks. Coastal Development purchases the property at auction, likely at a substantial discount given the current flooding issues. Any historical discoveries during subsequent development fall under standard salvage protocols, with no obligation for owner compensation. The threat was explicit. Cooperate now for partial benefit or lose everything. Before Jacob could respond, Washington's phone vibrated with an incoming message. Interesting timing, the curator remarked, reading the notification. It seems the State Underwater Archaeology Division received my preliminary report 20 minutes ago and has initiated emergency site protection measures under federal statute. Their team is currently en route with local law enforcement escorts, not Sheriff Davies, but state-level officers with jurisdiction over historical preservation enforcement. Mitchell's confidence visibly faltered. You're bluffing. Emergency measures require board approval. Not when evidence suggests imminent threat to artifacts of potential national historical significance, Washington countered. You're trespassing. Contractors provided that evidence quite convincingly. The security personnel exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not having anticipated legitimate archaeological authorities becoming involved. Jacob seized the moment of uncertainty. You have exactly 5 minutes to remove yourself and your people from my property, Dr. Mitchell. After that, you'll be explaining your unauthorized excavation attempts to state archaeological preservation officers. Mitchell's composure cracked. Completely, her academic veneer giving way to raw frustration. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Mercer. That submarine contains more than just gold and historical curiosities. There are documents, plans that were never meant for public disclosure. The vehemence of her response revealed something. Beyond academic ambition or financial motivation, something more personal and urgent. What documents? Jacob pressed, sensing vulnerability in her uncharacteristic emotional display. Instead of answering, Mitchell signaled sharply to her security. Team, we're leaving. For now. Her parting glance at Jacob carried unmistakable warning. This isn't over. As the vehicles departed, Washington turned to Jacob. She's right about one thing. This isn't over, and whatever documents she's concerned about may be the most historically significant aspect of this entire discovery. The state's underwater. Archaeology Division team arrived shortly before midnight, a 5-person unit led by Dr. Amelia Rodriguez, whose no-nonsense demeanor and practical approach immediately distinguished her from Mitchell's academic posturing. After reviewing Washington's documentation and Jacob's first-hand account, she established a temporary headquarters in the farmhouse kitchen with military efficiency. Mitchell's involvement complicates matters, Rodriguez noted, spreading topographical maps across the table. She has political connections through the Historical Society and private funding sources that give her considerable influence. However, her methods have raised concerns among professional archaeologists for years. The team included 2 marine archaeology specialists, a historical conservator, and a security consultant with law enforcement background. Their presence transformed Clearwater Meadows from vulnerable isolation to a protected historical site. Literally overnight, we've established a legal perimeter, Rodriguez explained, indicating boundaries on the map. State archaeological preservation statutes give us authority to restrict access pending preliminary assessment. Mitchell knows the regulations. She helped draft several of them, which means she'll be looking for loopholes or jurisdictional challenges. Jacob provided copies of Ezekiel's journal and the documents recovered from the submarine, which the historical conservator immediately began processing for proper preservation. Washington contributed his preliminary authentication findings, creating a comprehensive initial assessment that Rodriguez's team could build upon. The most urgent concern is site security, the security consultant explained. Based on Mitchell's pattern of escalation, we should anticipate further attempts to access the submarine, potentially using the foreclosure deadline as leverage. 3 weeks isn't much time, Jacob acknowledged, the bank's deadline looming. Over even these extraordinary developments, Rodriguez examined the property survey thoughtfully. There might be a solution that addresses both security and your financial situation, Mr. Mercer. The National Historic Preservation Act includes provisions for emergency acquisition of historically significant private property under threat of development or destruction. You mean the government would buy my farm? Jacob asked, uncomfortable with the prospect despite his financial predicament. Not exactly, Rodriguez clarified. It's more of a conservation easement. You retain ownership of the property while receiving compensation for preserving its historical features. The submarine and a surrounding buffer zone would be designated a protected archaeological site under your stewardship, with funding for proper recovery and preservation. Washington nodded approvingly. It's an elegant solution. The historical easement payment would address your immediate financial concerns while maintaining your family's connection to the property. For the first time since discovering the submarine, Jacob felt cautious optimism. The arrangement would preserve both his ancestral connection to the land and the historical significance of what lay beneath it, while resolving the immediate financial crisis. How quickly can this be implemented? He asked, aware of the dwindling time frame before foreclosure. I've already initiated the paperwork, Rodriguez replied. With the evidence we've documented and the clear historical significance, we can expedite the process. However, she cautioned, Mitchell will certainly challenge this approach through her academic and political connections, which is why we need to strengthen our position with irrefutable evidence, Washington added. We need to document the submarine and its contents more comprehensively than my preliminary survey allowed, Rodriguez agreed. My team brought specialized underwater documentation equipment. By morning, we'll be ready to conduct a proper archaeological assessment of your submarine, Mr. Mercer, without draining your pond. For the first time in months, Jacob slept soundly, knowing that Clearwater Meadows was no longer his burden to protect alone. Dawn brought clear skies for the first time in weeks, a meteorological reprieve that felt symbolic as Jacob watched. Rodriguez's team deploy their specialized equipment around the pond. Unlike Mitchell's covert contractors, these professionals established a methodical grid system across the water's surface, using buoys to mark precise coordinates for their underwater survey. We're using multi-beam sonar imaging combined with magnetometer readings, Rodriguez explained as technicians calibrated sophisticated instruments on a small research pontoon. This will provide comprehensive three-dimensional mapping of the submarine's current position and condition without physical disturbance. By mid-morning, the first composite images appeared on monitors set up in a field tent near the pond's edge. The submarine's outline emerged with startling clarity, a sleek, innovative design that immediately confirmed Washington's assessment of its historical significance. "Remarkable preservation," the conservator murmured, examining the images. "The hull appears largely intact, with minimal structural degradation despite 150 years of submersion." The imaging revealed details invisible during Jacob's brief direct observation. The vessel's unique propulsion system, specialized ballast configuration, and most importantly, the cargo hold still containing what appeared to be multiple intact crates. Washington couldn't contain his professional excitement. This design represents a quantum leap beyond the Hunley. The Confederacy was developing advanced submersible technology that, had the war continued, might have altered naval warfare. Fundamentally, the underwater camera system provided even more remarkable imagery. The Confederate naval insignia clearly visible on the conning tower, the sophisticated hatch mechanism Jacob had briefly accessed, and tantalizing glimpses of the interior visible through small viewports. As the documentation progressed, Jacob received an unexpected call from his bank representative. "Mr. Mercer," the banker began with unusual deference, "we've been contacted by the State Historical Preservation Office regarding potential historical significance designation for your property. Under the circumstances, we're prepared to offer a 6-month extension on your note to accommodate the assessment process." The sudden reversal confirmed Rodriguez's influence and the power of official archaeological intervention. The breathing room would provide crucial time for the historical easement process to complete, potentially resolving his financial crisis entirely. The team's systematic documentation continued throughout the day, building an irrefutable case for the submarine's historical significance. By late afternoon, they had compiled sufficient evidence to justify a controlled recovery operation, the next phase in properly preserving the remarkable discovery. Jacob had just finished reviewing the preliminary assessment with Rodriguez when Washington received an urgent call from his museum colleague. "Mitchell's making a move," he reported grimly after ending the call. "She's filed an emergency injunction claiming prior research rights based on documents recovered from the Charleston Naval Repository. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Rodriguez appeared unfazed. "Expected but futile. Our documentation establishes clear archaeological priority under federal statutes." "There's more," Washington continued. "She's also submitted a formal complaint to the Historical Society Ethics Committee, claiming I violated professional protocols by conducting unauthorized assessment on a site she had previously documented." Though the accusations were baseless, they represented a typical Mitchell tactic, using bureaucratic entanglements to delay legitimate archaeological processes while pursuing alternative access. "She's desperate," Rodriguez observed, "which suggests whatever's in that submarine goes beyond historical artifacts or treasury gold." Jacob recalled Mitchell's uncharacteristic emotional reaction to the mention of documents. She specifically mentioned plans that were never meant for public disclosure. What could the Confederacy have been hiding that would still matter 150 years later? The answer lay within the submarine, tantalizing close yet still inaccessible beneath the murky waters. The retrieval operation began at dawn 3 days later, after Rodriguez's team secured an emergency court order overriding Mitchell's injunction attempts. The pond's water level had been partially lowered, not through pumping but by carefully engineered drainage channels that mimicked Ezekiel's original 19th century system, discovered during the archaeological survey. A specialized recovery platform positioned over the submarine allowed professional marine archaeologists to access the hatch Jacob had briefly opened. Following strict preservation protocols, they carefully documented every aspect of the vessel before extracting its historical contents. The submarine's cargo hold contained exactly what Ezekiel's journal had suggested: 14 wooden crates bearing Confederate treasury markings, their contents remarkably preserved by the vessel's watertight engineering. Under Rodriguez's supervision, each crate was carefully raised to the surface, documented, and transported to a mobile conservation unit established in one of Jacob's empty barns. The crates contained gold and silver coins worth millions in both precious metal and historical value, the final treasury shipment that had vanished from historical record in April 1865. But it was the document case, sealed in multiple layers of oilskin and lead, that proved most significant. These aren't just routine Confederate records, Washington breathed as the conservator carefully separated pages that had remained untouched since being sealed 150 years earlier. This is the actual contingency plan for Confederate leadership. The war continued, including technical schematics for advanced weapon systems that were never manufactured. The documents revealed why Mitchell had been so determined to gain private access to the submarine. Among the papers was a detailed family tree connecting several prominent contemporary Southern political families, including Mitchell's own, directly to high-ranking Confederate officials implicated in war crimes that had been successfully concealed from historical record. No wonder she wanted these documents contained, Rodriguez observed. These revelations would rewrite portions of Civil War history and tarnish several important political legacies. For Jacob, however, the most profound discovery was personal. Among Ezekiel's papers was a handwritten confession explaining the true source of his post-war wealth. Not stolen Confederate gold, as some might assume, but a personal reward from a Union general in exchange for crucial intelligence that had hastened the war's end and saved countless lives. Your great-great-grandfather was working as a double agent, Washington explained as Jacob read the document with growing amazement. While officially serving in the Confederate Navy, he was secretly providing information to Union intelligence about Confederate naval operations and technology. The pond, the repository, had been Ezekiel's final mission, creating a hiding place for the submarine, not to preserve Confederate assets for some future resurrection of the cause, but to prevent its advanced technology from falling into the hands of either side. His subsequent purchase of the property had been strategic, ensuring the submarine remained safely contained until proper historical context could be established. 6 months later, Clearwater Meadows had transformed. The historical easement had resolved Jacob's financial crisis while preserving his family's connection to the land. A portion of the farm operated as a working agricultural enterprise, while the pond and surrounding acres had been developed into the Mercer Civil War Naval Heritage Center, a research facility and museum showcasing the H.L. Mosquito and its remarkable story. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell had resigned from her academic positions following revelations about her methodologies and motivations, her reputation irreparably damaged by ethics investigations. Catherine Blackwell and Coastal Development Partners had quietly withdrawn from the region, their development plans abandoned. Standing at the edge of the pond, now restored to its original dimensions, with Ezekiel's drainage system properly reconstructed, Jacob reflected on how a desperate measure during a rainstorm had uncovered not just historical treasure, but his family's true legacy. Not Confederate loyalty, but moral courage during the nation's darkest chapter. He would be proud, Washington said, joining Jacob beside the informational plaque that now told visitors the true story of Lieutenant Ezekiel Mercer and his secret mission. Jacob nodded, finally understanding the burden his ancestor had carried. He protected this secret for a reason. Maybe the timing was always meant to be this way. Revealed when the country could finally face its complete history, not just the comfortable parts. The submarine, carefully raised and preserved, now rested in a specialized conservation facility, where visitors could witness firsthand the remarkable technological innovation it represented, and the complicated moral choices of those who had created it. What had begun as a farmer's desperate attempt to save his land had become something far more significant, the recovery of a historical truth that had waited patiently beneath the waters of a South Carolina farm pond for more than a century and a half to tell its story. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.